Hello and welcome to the Deep Sea Iceberg. Today I'm going to be covering all the strange and mysterious phenomena of the ocean. This iceberg is going to be a little bit different than your regular icebergs because instead of ranking things by obscurity, I'm going to be ranking things by depth. We're going to start off by covering strange things that happen at the surface of the ocean, and we're going to finish it with entries from the bottom of the Hadal Zone. So with that all out of the way, let's get started with Tier 1, the Sunlight Zone. The Sunlight Zone is also referred to as the Epipelagic Zone and covers from the surface to around 200 meters deep, which is roughly 656 feet. The reason it's called the Sunlight Zone is pretty self-explanatory. In this area there is a lot of sunlight which allows all sorts of different plant and animal life to occur. Before we get started, I thought I should acknowledge the fact that I'm wearing a shirt that says "Women want me, fish fear me," which I thought would be funny given the topic of this video, and it is a reference to my absolute prowess on the rod. However, I didn't realize that due to the framing, it just says "women want me," which I feel kind of bad about because when I made this channel, I made a vow to not spread misinformation. Now with that out of the way, let's get started with our first entry. Heracleion. Heracleion was a city that existed for over 16 centuries and was situated at the mouth of the River Nile. Heracleion was one of Egypt's most significant ports as it served as a gateway into the interior. It also was a critical point in which ships could restock after a long journey. However, in the 8th century, it just disappeared off the face of the earth. We've known that this city had existed for many years because of its role in many significant historical texts. It also held a lot of mythological significance, as many notable temples were located within it, such as the temple dedicated to Hercules, which in turn gave the city its name. Due to the plethora of written records about the city, many people have tried to find it. However, no one had any luck till a man named Frank Gaudio. Frank Gaudio was a very interesting man who had many different jobs, such as one being as a financial advisor to the Saudi government. However, he is primarily known for his work as an underwater archaeologist. He's also the grandson of the inventor of the modern catamaran, which I mean is kind of off topic of what we're talking about, but interesting enough that I was like, I'm going to mention this. In the early 2000s, Frank Gaudio led an expedition in search of the missing city, and against all odds was actually able to find it. Heracleion is one of these interesting cases in which it shares a lot of similarities to places like Atlantis. However, I find it interesting that no one really knows about it simply because it's been found, and these missing cities kind of lose all their allure once they are discovered. How eels reproduce. What if I told you that we only just found out how freshwater eels reproduce? I know this sounds crazy, but across history, many different notable historical figures have tried to solve this elusive riddle. One such figure was Sigmund Freud, who while as a medical student dissected hundreds of eels in search of their testicles. However, he never found them. This is because eels don't develop sex organs until just before they reproduce. In 2022, a new paper was published providing insight into how eels actually mate. However, what they found was very strange. They found that European eels will travel for 18 months until they reach the Sargasso Sea, which is located within the Bermuda Triangle. While traveling, these eels will dive incredibly deep to around 1,400 meters, which is roughly around 46,000 feet. It is believed that while traveling at these depths is when they start to develop their sexual organs. It's theorized that once these now female eels reach the Bermuda Triangle, they will release a bunch of their eggs into the water, which then the now male eels will go and fertilize. More research is desperately needed to understand eel mating patterns. In fact, the population of the European eel has shrunk by 95% since the 1980s and are now considered critically endangered. Point Nemo. Point Nemo is also referred to as the oceanic pole of inaccessibility. This is because Point Nemo is the spot in the ocean that is furthest away from any land. In fact, it is so remote that if you sailed out to it, the closest person to you would be someone in the International Space Station. Also, because it is so far from land, there is no plane or boat routes within 400 kilometers of Point Nemo. However, Point Nemo has another name, and that is the spacecraft cemetery. Once spacecrafts like space stations and satellites become too difficult to maintain, they crash down into Earth. And what better place to do that than literally the most remote part of the planet? In fact, the International Space Station that I mentioned earlier is actually scheduled to crash into Point Nemo in 2031. Needless to say, there is many conspiracy theories about what could possibly be going on at Point Nemo, because it's a little odd that these governments and multi-billion-dollar corporations are just crashing their almost priceless satellites just into the ocean. Some people theorize there might be secret government bases down there or portals to other dimensions. It also doesn't help that Lovecraft placed the fictional city of Rayleigh within Point Nemo, which apparently is the sea in which Cthulhu is imprisoned. Where did Earth get its water? Just like the entry about the eels, I was kind of confused when I first read that we didn't know where Earth got its water, because it just seems like a mystery that should have been solved by now. It was upon researching for this video which I found out how rare it is for planets to have large, stable bodies of water. In fact, out of the nearly 6,000 planets we have directly observed, guess how many have large bodies of water on its surface? If you said 1, you would be correct. There is 1 planet and you are standing on it. This is because if a planet is located too close or too far away from its respective sun, then all the water would either evaporate or turn to ice. In fact, there has only been around 40 planets that have been observed that occupy a zone in which water could exist. This is called a habitable zone, or more commonly known, a Goldilocks zone. But how did our water get here? The current theory is that it came from multiple sources. It was likely when the Earth first formed that there was some water trapped within it. The rest of the water most likely came from water-filled meteorites or comets crashing into the surface of the Earth. Interestingly enough, we're actually losing some of our water to space. When water evaporates, it sometimes breaks up into its components of oxygen and hydrogen. With all the free-floating hydrogen, it sometimes rises so high that it escapes the pull of Earth's gravitational field and floats off into space. Tier 2, the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone, also referred to as the Mesopelagic Zone, is the area in which we start to lose a significant portion of our sunlight. The zone is located between 200 and 1,000 meters, and it is where we start to see some animals that developed adaptations to deal with the increasing pressure and lower light. Phytoplankton. At the top of the Twilight Zone, there lives these small microscopic plants called phytoplankton. The term the lungs of the world is commonly used in reference to the Amazon rainforest. However, this is kind of some stolen valor, because at most, the Amazon rainforest only produces around 9% of the oxygen. This is nothing compared to phytoplankton. In the most conservative estimate, phytoplankton produces around 50% of the world's oxygen, with some people even suggesting it may be as high as 80%. These plants also serve as the foundation for many of the ocean's food webs. Honestly speaking, phytoplankton might single-handedly be the most important organism on our planet. However, across the globe, phytoplankton populations are shrinking. If phytoplankton goes extinct, then we're going to see a mass extinction of marine life. This is also not great for us, as 80% of our oxygen would be gone, which some might say is not great. But don't worry, I'm sure the world's governments are taking this threat to our existence really seriously. The coelacanth. The coelacanth is a prehistoric fish with fossils dating back to 66 million years ago. To put this in perspective, 66 million years ago is when it's believed that the asteroid hit the Earth, killing all the dinosaurs. The coelacanth had been extinct for all of human history, until one day a man was fishing off the coast of South Africa and he just happened to find one. This earned the coelacanth the nickname the living fossil, because of the way it just seemingly came back into existence. I first heard about the coelacanth back in 2007 because it was in the DS game Animal Crossing Wild World. I explicitly remember my brother spending ages trying to catch this fish. I remember him explaining to me that it was once thought to be extinct, however we managed to find one. At the time I didn't realize how crazy this was because, I was 5 years old. But now looking back, it's actually pretty crazy to think about because it's almost like me today walking through the woods and just happening across a velociraptor, because they went extinct at similar times, give or take a few million years. It seems that the reason the coelacanth remained undiscovered for so long is because it typically hangs out at depths from around 90 to 700 meters, placing it pretty deep within the Twilight Zone. It also does make you think about what animals that we once thought were extinct, or animals that we haven't discovered yet, might simply just be lurking within the deep ocean. The 2003 Great White Shark Incident. In 2003, a group of researchers captured, tagged, and released a 9-foot-long great white shark nicknamed Alpha. A few months later, Alpha's tag was found washed up on a beach. However, it wasn't attached to any shark. Upon reading the data from the tag, we were able to see that everything was normal for a while. This was until we saw a sudden increase in temperature, with the shark diving to around 580 meters deep. Although great whites are known to dive quite deep, they usually hang around in shallower waters, which actually is the reason why they are quite dangerous to humans, because their feeding grounds tend to overlap with areas we like to swim. The concerning thing isn't so much as the sudden dive, it is more so the increase in temperature. Typically, the deeper you go and the further away from the sun you get, it gets colder. However, that's not what the tag showed. It actually showed a fairly stable warm reading, which implies that the tag was in the stomach of something that had killed and eaten the shark. But what could have possibly eaten a 9-foot long great white? The most logical explanation to this was a larger cannibalistic great white. It also could have been something like an orca. The more fun explanation though is that it is some unknown giant predator. This theory is also not that far-fetched, as it is estimated that 91% of ocean species remain undiscovered. With no one knowing for sure, there is countless conspiracies about what could have eaten the shark. Until this day, we don't know for certain. The 45-meter long sea worm. Off the coast of Western Australia, there was found a 45-meter long sea worm. Upon closer inspection, this wasn't a worm at all, but instead a colony of tiny little organisms attached together. The structure is called a siphonophore, and even upon researching it, I struggle to explain what it is exactly. It appears that even though the structure is comprised of many different organisms, they're all kind of clones of one another, coming from a single fertilized egg. This has caused some debate about whether or not it should be considered a single creature, because if it is, it would become the longest creature on Earth. I honestly can't tell you what is scarier, finding a 45-meter long sea worm or finding a colony of creatures working together to form a giant worm. I'm gonna be honest, either explanation I don't love. For the life of me, I can't tell you how deep this specific worm was found. However, the siphonophores are typically found at around 1,000 meters deep, which places them just on the border between the midnight zone and the twilight zone. Tier 3, the Midnight Zone. The Midnight Zone is also referred to as the bathypelagic zone and spans from 1,000 to 4,000 meters. It gets its name because from here on out there is no sunlight whatsoever. The zone is shrouded in darkness, but despite the lack of light, many different creatures still call this area home. Deep sea gigantism. Around 1,000 meters deep, you start to see deep sea gigantism, also referred to as abyssal gigantism, which is very confusing because the abyssal zone is the next zone, yet you see it way before it. Like, come on people, words mean things. The term refers to the phenomena in which the deeper you get in the ocean, the larger the animals seem to get. This is why you get things like giant squids and sperm whales. There's a variety of reasons for why this phenomenon might occur. Many of the theories revolve around the fact that the deeper you go in the ocean, the further you get away from the sun, and the colder the environment becomes. In biology, there is a principle called Bergmann's rule, which states that in colder climates, the larger the animals tend to be. The larger you are, the greater your body's volume is compared to its surface area. This is crucial in maintaining your body's heat. Also, the deeper you get in the ocean, the less things there are, which means that creatures there tend to not have a lot of natural predators. This means you can be as big and slow as you want and no one's going to come along and eat you. Also, larger animals tend to have a slower metabolism, which means they can go longer periods of time without eating. The next entry on this list is the perfect example of this principle. The Greenland shark. The Greenland shark typically live between 100 and 1,200 meters deep. However, they've been known to dive as deep as 2,200 meters. The sharks typically prefer colder climates, so you'll see them closer to the surface in the winter, but when it gets to summer, they'll tend to dive deeper. You've probably heard of these sharks before, and that is because they typically have these freakishly long lifespans, with it being estimated that they might live as long as 500 years. This means that there might be sharks living today that are older than the Protestants or the founding of the United States. The physiology of the Greenland shark is quite interesting because they have these super slow metabolisms, which is believed to be the reason they live so long. This also means that the Greenland shark can sometimes go months without eating. However, the downside of this is that they grow incredibly slowly, only growing about 1 centimeter each year. They age so slowly that it normally takes them around 150 years before they reach sexual maturity and can produce offspring. Greenland sharks are also usually blind, and this is because there is a specific parasite that targets the Greenland shark's eyeball. However, this doesn't typically affect the shark because they don't really use their eyes at all. Due to it being so dark, they primarily rely on their sense of hearing and smell to find their food. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, please consider subscribing. I really enjoy making these videos, and it's super encouraging every time I see that number go up. Because I'm so small, it really is encouraging when I see that someone enjoyed the video so much that they decided to subscribe. The Eltanin antenna. The Eltanin antenna refers to this mysterious object that was photographed on the sea floor in 1964. The object is named after the USNS Eltanin, which is the ship that discovered it. Needless to say, there were a lot of conspiracy theories about what this thing could be. Many people believe that it might be some kind of alien artifact, such as Bruce Cathy, who has published several books on UFOs as well as a variety of other conspiracy theories. In fact, his book Harmonic 33 features the antenna as its cover. Also, shout out to Internet Archive, who always has a copy of these weird books. For example, the video I did on Joan Quigley, I needed a copy of her book, and even though I now have a printed copy of it, that took weeks to get here, so shout out to Internet Archive, you make doing these videos possible. Many people came to the logical conclusion that the Eltanin antenna is some kind of alien artifact. Unfortunately, many nerds and Poindexters have tried to ruin everyone's fun by saying that it's not in fact an alien artifact, but actually just a ping pong tree sponge, which is a type of carnivorous sea sponge that lives on the sea floor found in the area in which the antenna was photographed. Thanks, nerds. The Colossal Squid. The Colossal Squid is probably the most well-known entry on this iceberg. However, I did consider it important to add simply because it's kind of become representative of the mysteries of the ocean. And when people think of deep sea creatures, they tend to think of something like the Colossal Squid. Stories of sea monsters have been around since people were first stupid enough to sail out into open ocean. Stories of the Kraken date back to the 12th century. However, it wasn't until 1925 in which we confirmed that these giant squids actually exist. We first confirmed their existence by dissecting a sperm whale and finding the beak of a colossal squid in its stomach. This is because seeing a colossal squid is incredibly rare. In fact, only 12 specimens have ever been collected and only 6 of them are adults. In fact, the first adult specimen wasn't even captured until 2007. Colossal squids can grow up to around 14 meters and weigh around 700 kilograms, which is around 1,500 pounds. We were able to find younger squids way before we found adults, and this is simply because adult squids tend to live deeper. Young squids will tend to live at around the 500 meter mark, while adult squids will tend to dive as deep as 2,000 meters. This places adult squids firmly within the midnight zone. Colossal squids are very interesting because for the longest time they were considered mythological creatures, which kind of goes to show that sometimes mythology is just undiscovered science. It also begs the question, what other mythological creatures exist that we just don't know about? My money's on Mothman. Please be Mothman. I really want it to be Mothman. I love you. Tier 4. The Abyssal Zone. The Abyssal Zone is also known as the Pelagic Zone, and this is where we start to get really deep. Located between 4,000 and 6,000 meters, there is no chance sunlight can penetrate this deep. This means that no plant life can exist here whatsoever. It's also in this zone that wildlife starts to get really freaky. This is the largest biome in the world and covers around 83% of the ocean's total volume. The Abyssal Zone gets its name from the Greek word meaning bottomless, and it is here in which you start to feel like you are descending into hell. The Faceless Cusk. The faceless cusk is probably the ugliest fish known to man. This fish looks like God was sitting up there in heaven, looking at his little spore creation screen, thinking, it's good enough. No one's gonna see it. It lives too deep. And I wish I hadn't. The faceless cusk got its name because, as you can see, it doesn't have a face. And despite its appearance, it actually does have eyes. However, they are covered by this thick layer of skin, which somehow makes the fish even more horrifying. Luckily, this is a very rare species with only a few specimens ever being collected. Honestly, I think it would be better if we all just collectively agree that this fish doesn't exist and just forget we ever saw it. The faceless cusk is typically found between 4,000 and 5,000 meters deep. And you might be thinking, if it doesn't have a face, how does it eat? Well, it actually does have a mouth. It's just located on the underside of its head. Just like a catfish, it actually has these little whiskers which helps it find food, which usually consists of small little invertebrates and crustaceans. This fish was discovered in 1870. However, it wasn't until 2017 which we got much better photos of it, in which its popularity began to grow. We were like this close to forgetting this thing existed. We just couldn't let sleeping dogs lie. Honestly, this fish might cost me from going to heaven, because how on earth can I believe a good God exists when I have to share a planet with this abomination? Tamu Massif. Tamu Massif is the world's largest volcano. It is a shield volcano that is roughly around 4,500 meters tall. It also covers around 500,000 square kilometers, which is roughly around 214,000 square miles. That is bigger than the size of France. It's honestly so big that I was confused about where to put it on the iceberg, because its base is situated a few hundred meters into the Hadal zone, whilst its summit is halfway through the midnight zone. And because the majority of it is situated in the abyssal zone, I thought I'd just put it there. It also has nothing to do with the fact that I have too many entries in the other zones, and so I needed a place to put it. Although how this volcano formed is still largely a mystery, it most likely has something to do with the last period of geomagnetic reversal. Geomagnetic reversal refers to a period in which the North and South poles switch, and this tends to have a large impact on the climate as well as tectonic plate movements. Unlike regular shield volcanoes, Tamu Massif seemed to form through the shifting of tectonic plates, in which when they went further apart, more magma came from under the Earth's crust, forming the volcano. This is different from a typical shield volcano, which forms through individual eruptions, with each one making it slightly larger. If you're interested in geology, I highly recommend looking into it because it is very interesting. And I'm sorry, I am not doing this entry justice. Zombie worms. Zombie worms are deep sea worms that infest the bones of deceased whales. They are officially called ozdaks, which is derived from Latin meaning bone eaters. These worms have a crazy size disparity between the different sexes, with female worms appearing 20,000 times larger than male worms. Although zombie worms do consume the fat that is inside the marrow of the whale bones, they actually also get nutrients from consuming the bones themselves. Zombie worms do look very unique, and that is partly because of their weird, big, feathery plumes. The worms don't have mouths or digestive systems, and get their nutrients directly from their big plume that is filled with this type of bacteria that can actually digest the whale bones. These worms have been around for millions of years, and although they typically eat whales, they have also been known to eat other large animals. We know this because we're actually able to find paleosaur fossils with zombie worms fossilized within their bones. Zombie worm is also more of an umbrella term. At the time of recording, we know of 26 different types of zombie worms. In fact, if you actually find a carcass of a whale on the seafloor, you'll typically find several different species of zombie worms inhabiting their bones. Tier 5. The Hadal Zone. The Hadal Zone is also known as the Hadiopelagic Zone, which is the deepest part of the ocean. If the abyssal zone is your descent into hell, then the Hadal Zone is hell itself, which is actually fitting because it gets its name from the Greek god Hades. It typically ranges from around 6,000 meters to roughly 11,000 meters, or wherever the bottom of the ocean is. The average depth of the ocean is only 3,500 meters deep, which means that the Hadal Zone is typically reserved for only deep sea trenches. Life here is sparse, and this is typically because the pressure is just so immense. The pressure of the Hadal Zone is around 1,100 atmospheres. So if the Hadal Zone is so uninhabitable, what could possibly exist at the bottom of the world? The USS Samuel B. Roberts and Victor Vescovo. So I've had to re-record this section because, you know, it wouldn't be a Saints video if I didn't mess up something with the recording. But anyway, the USS Samuel B. Roberts is the world's deepest shipwreck. Nicknamed the Sammy B, the ship was a destroyer escort for the US Navy in World War II. 1942. The ship was sunk in a battle against the Japanese, and in total 104 men died. Some died during the battle itself, while some died later as a result of their wounds, and some actually were eaten by sharks while waiting for rescue. The ship sunk into the Philippine Trench and now rests at a depth of around 6,895 meters, which is roughly around 22,621 feet. It was discovered in June of 2022 by a man named Victor Vescovo. Victor Vescovo is a very, very interesting character whose name has popped up a lot while researching this video. This is because many of our discoveries in the recent years about the deep ocean are attributed to him and his team. Victor Vescovo was originally a private equity investor, however he has since retired and now dedicates his time to deep ocean exploration. Upon researching Victor Vescovo for this video, it seems that his life's passion is using the vast amounts of wealth he's acquired to find new and interesting ways to almost kill himself. I say this because Victor Vescovo is one of 500 people to ever complete the 7 summits, which for those of you who don't know, is where you climb to the highest point in every continent, including Antarctica. Also, back in 2019, he was awarded the Guinness Book World Record for the person who traveled the most vertical distance without leaving Earth. And this is partly because Victor Vescovo is one of the 27 people to make it to Challenger's Deep, which is the deepest part of the ocean. I know talking about Victor Vescovo is a little off topic. However, the sheer amount of times this man's name has come up while researching, I just thought I had to mention him, especially because he and his team are responsible for discovering so many of these deep ocean creatures, as well as mapping a lot of what we know about the deep ocean. The big fin squid. The big fin squid is this creepy looking bugger. This image of the big fin squid was taken in 2007 by the Shell Oil Company at around 2,500 meters deep. It's honestly a miracle that we even got this photo, because typically the big fin squid lives much, much deeper, typically around 6,000 meters deep. This squid just looks like an alien, and I think it's partly because it is one of the few squids that's tentacles shoot out perpendicular from its body. Due to the incredible depth in which it lives, we've never been able to get an intact specimen. Not only does the squid have elbows, its legs are also disproportionately long for its body. Typically, squids will have legs normally around 5 times the length of its mantle. However, the big fin squid has legs over 20 times the length of its body. Due to how hard these things are to find, we just don't really know anything about them. This has led many people to make assumptions about how the big fin squid uses these arms. Many people believe that it will drag its arms across the seabed until it catches something edible, in which it will then use it to pull it up to its mouth. However, this is unconfirmed, as we've never been able to directly observe any of its feeding behaviors. Honestly, this thing is really cool, and I'm glad we know it exists, unlike certain deep sea creatures. The expedition to Challenger's Deep. Challenger's Deep is the deepest part of the ocean. Sitting at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, it is roughly 11,000 meters deep. So far, only 27 people have ever made it to the bottom of the ocean. This is pretty significant, as it is only 3 more than people who have walked on the surface of the moon. Because this is the bottom of the ocean and this is the deep sea iceberg, I thought it would be fitting to end this video by talking about the first expedition to Challenger's Deep. In 1960, 2 men, Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard, embarked on an expedition to the bottom of the world. Jacques Piccard was an oceanographer who enlisted the help of the US Navy in order to aid him in his quest to reaching the bottom of the ocean. The space race had been going on for about 5 years now, and due to the immense pressure at the bottom of the ocean, many people saw this as a great opportunity to test some of the systems that would be later used in the Apollo 11 spacecraft. On their way down to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, one of the window panes of their sub cracked. Now at this point, any rational person would have turned around and abandoned mission. However, these two decided to go even deeper. At the end of their nearly 5-hour descent, they reached the bottom of Challenger's Deep. After this expedition, the bottom of the ocean was not visited again until nearly 60 years later, when out of all people, James Cameron, the director of the Titanic, did a solo expedition to Challenger's Deep. In the last decade, more and more people have been visiting Challenger's Deep, including the aforementioned Victor Vescovo. However, even with the increasing amount of expeditions, Challenger's Deep remains one of the most undiscovered and mysterious places of the planet. This brings us to the end of the iceberg. Anyway, thank you for sticking with me to the end of the video. I'm a small channel, so it really does mean a lot to me that someone decided that these little videos I'm making in my room is worth their time. I loved learning about all of these entries, so if I missed any, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I always love hearing about things that I didn't previously know about. If you like this video, you might like this one as well. It's where I explore a small town in Japan and kind of tell you a little bit about its folklore. That's all I've got to say, and I really look forward to seeing you in the next one.